Good morning, everyone. Thank you. Got feedback. Today, Dominic and I will be presenting the findings of 2 excavations from the Scottish borders. I'll be presenting first before handing over to Dominic, who will be presenting his findings. Then we'll briefly have a look at the 2 main contrasts between the sites. So this is just a brief summary of our separate excavations. My own was a low-lying multi-period site which spanned from the late Bronze Age to the medieval. The site suffered extensive truncation, likely due to intensive farming, and as such, interpretation has been especially difficult. No obvious structural remains were found, however a small artefactual and ecofactual assemblage has allowed us to understand the range of activity on site. Dominic's site was an upland site entirely within the Bronze Age, demonstrating evidence for multi-phase occupation and was used for domestic purposes only. So this is just a bit of project background for my site. Popple Burn Park was a 3-phase excavation which ran from 2018 to 2021. The site was located to the immediate west of the village of Edinburgh, north-east of Kelso in the Scottish borders. In terms of archaeological background, there are minimal confirmed prehistoric remains in the wider area, with the exception of a possible Iron Age fort and a possible unenclosed settlement some 350 metres to the southwest. The recorded history of Edinburgh can be traced to the 12th century, when it is mentioned concerning the ownership of 2 chapels attached to the parish, and again in 1348 in a writ of Edward III. A number of finds have been recovered over the years during various field walks and metal detecting surveys, including an early medieval bell, a coin hoard from the reign of Edward I and Edward II, Scottish pennies of Alexander III, and ceramic shards dating from the 14th century. So here we have the post-excavation plan of the site, and as you can see, the activity is concentrated to fairly specific areas. This is due to the high degree of truncation that I mentioned earlier that was noted during the excavation. It's evident especially here, along the southwest boundary where all archaeology remains cease. Sorry. Now, the reason why anything has survived at all is that this area lies in a recess in the landscape with a much deeper topsoil, which has protected these features to some degree. Even still, we have some disruption from modern deposits, such as the large oval deposit to the north and the drain which bisects the site from the northeast to the southwest. Up on the screen now, bottom left is a general shot of site with images in the top and the right-hand side trying to show the sloping topsoil getting progressively shallower as it heads towards the north. There we go. Try to be too fancy. A variety of features recorded across this excavation area, totaling almost 80 in number. We had linears, the remains of a stone boundary wall, post holes, pits, and well as modern services and disturbance. The majority of the features comprise pit cuts concentrated in the central and southern parts of the site. Now, what follows is a breakdown of different periods of occupation across the site with date ranges as well as associated features. The Bronze Age activity was recorded in 2 features and was determined solely by radiocarbon dating, providing dates of 11th to the 9th century BC. The Iron Age activity appeared to be slightly more abundant on site and was determined by ceramics recovered from pits 44 and 78, which can be seen in the slide now. And these were dated to the 6th, 4th century BC and 2nd, 4th century AD. Early medieval activity was found to be mixed amongst the Bronze Age features. Radiocarbon dating was successful and a close cluster of dates from the late 8th century to 9th century were obtained. Medieval activity was represented by 3 pits and a possible field boundary. Medieval ceramics recovered from pits 501 and 502, as seen on the slide, with radiocarbon dates providing dates of 12th to the 13th century and 14th to the 15th century. Now, despite the information gathered from the artefact and macroplant assemblage, determining the phasing for this site has been especially difficult due to poor preservation. The majority of the features comprise pit cuts concentrated in the central and southern parts of the site. The Bronze Age activity was recorded in 2 features and The phasing seen in this plan demonstrates a limited attempt to determine the confirmed areas of activity. As can be seen, the Bronze Age is concentrated predominantly to the centre, with the Iron Age more towards the west. The early medieval is mixed amongst the Bronze Age, and the medieval activity is firmly towards the east. Now, as you can see, there is a discernible curving pattern in the centre of the site. However, no obvious structures were noted, and none of these features did appear to form any structures. To further hamper interpretation, the majority of the features across the site were found to contain almost sterile deposits, resulting in datable features being limited in number. Now, granted, this information provides us with evidence of these different periods of occupation on site, but not much else. What this site does provide us with, however, is an opportunity to observe the development of crops grown. The macroplant assemblage numbered 776 plant remains and comprised of cereals, vegetables, woodland and weeds, with a preservation which for the most part ranged from adequate to good. The earliest cereal crops recovered at Popple dated to the Bronze Age, with 84 caryopses collected from pits 86 and 109. As can be seen, hull barley was the dominant crop, followed by cereal, oats and barley. This indicates that hull barley was an important species cultivated in the later Bronze Age, which is unsurprising as it is well suited to colder, wet climates and has had a major role in Scottish agriculture since prehistory. The assemblage from the early medieval deposits numbered 33 caryopses. The dominant species being grown in the area was still hull barley, followed by oat, barley, bread or club wheat and cereal. Oh, cereal's gone. While hull barley continued to play an important dietary role, the increase in exploitation of oats is significant. So I've got ahead of myself. So yeah, hull barley is still a dominant crop. This indicates that during the Iron Age, hull barley continued to play an important role at Popple. So the assemblage from the early medieval deposits numbered 33 caryopses. The dominant species being grown in the area was still hull barley, followed by oat, barley, bread or club wheat, and cereal. While hull barley continued to play an important dietary role during this period, the increase in exploitation of oats is significant and follows a wider pattern of agricultural change across Scotland. Bread or club wheat also makes its first appearance in the assemblage during this period, which corresponds to its increased importance throughout the medieval northern Britain. Now, the bulk of the cereal assemblage came from the medieval deposits, with a total of 292 caryopses recovered from 2 pits. The dominant species was oat, followed by bread or club wheat, hull barley, wheat, barley, rye, cultivated oat and cereal. This marks a change in agricultural practices at Popple throughout the medieval period, with oats becoming the more dominant species, followed by bread or club wheat, while hull barley took on a tertiary role. The increase of oats within medieval assemblage is consistent with the wider pattern of oat exploitation in Scotland and northern England. Oats are tolerant of wet climates and poor soils, which makes them suitable for cultivation in Scotland. Similarly, the increase in bread or club wheat exploitation is common for the period. Now onto the ceramic assemblage. The ceramic assemblage recovered during the excavation was small and poorly preserved, however was still able to provide some information in supporting the dates obtained from radiocarbon dating. Starting first with the prehistoric assemblage, a total of 11 sherds and small fragments of handmade low-fire ceramic pots were recovered during the excavation and subsequent soil sample processing, with all but one coming from pit 44. Unfortunately, the size of the fragments, condition and absence of defining features meant it was impossible to confidently date the features beyond the late prehistoric. The medieval pottery assemblage from Popple comprised of 12 sherds recovered from pits 501 and 502. 9 of these were identified as possibly representing 6 discrete vessels. 8 of these were identified as Scottish white gritty ware, and the last as a fragment of red ware. The white gritty ware supports the radiocarbon date, suggesting a date range from the 12th to the 13th century, while the fragment of red ware belongs to a broader date range of 12th to the 14th century. Although comparable sites in the immediate area are few, investigations from a medieval site at Swinton, 9.5 miles away, were found to have concentrations of pits enclosed by a field boundary, with the majority containing a high quantity of ceramic shards, seen in this slide. Dating to a period similar to those recovered from Popple, it is hoped that comparing the results of Swinton will help our interpretation of Popple. So, in summary, We have a substantial macro plant assemblage that was demonstrated that has demonstrated we have activity from Popple ranging from the late Bronze Age to the medieval period, which is supported by a small ceramic assemblage. Unfortunately, due to the overall preservation of the site and lack of any obvious structures, it means that interpretation of the site is limited to an acknowledgement of periods of occupation, essentially providing us with a snapshot of activity in the area. However, the information is of benefit in observing the evolution of crops grown within the Edinburgh area from the prehistoric to the medieval. And finally, information of prehistoric activity, however limited, is still beneficial to our understanding of prehistoric activity within the borders area. And with that, I pass on to Dom.
Hi folks, I'll be taking you through the excavation at Weeburn Head. So in 2020, AOC was commissioned to undertake work on 2 platforms on the hillside above the town of Cardrona near Peebles. This was in response to the accidental planting of new trees on Forestry Commission land. We uncovered the remains of 2 prehistoric settlements. One of these settlements was firmly dated to the Middle Bronze Age, specifically between 1436 BC and 1217 BC. We recovered a variety of finds and environmental evidence from the sites. However, due to time constraints and also the incoming COVID pandemic, we unfortunately had to cut our work short. Moving on. So as you can see here, that's how that works. We are right there's between there's Cardrona. We are high in the hillside, or right above it. We had a cracking view of the valley looking to the west, which is brilliant in February because you could see all the snow and the rain coming hurtling towards you. That was delightful. And 2 platforms, roughly about 50 metres approximately apart. Platform 2 was our primary focus, and we had platform 1 over here just to the north of it. Carbon dating forms. As I mentioned, the dating was taken from 3 sources within platform 2, all of which return from one of the hearths, a postal, and from the stone bank at the rear of the platform to the east of site. So platform 1. As I mentioned, platform 1 was the more northern of the 2. It was excavated in the form of 2 L-shaped offset trenches. So as you can see, up to the north and with the bank to the east here, this is obviously the edge of the platform over this way. Unfortunately, we came down on the first archaeological horizon we arrived at was a layer of what appeared to be stone rubble. We'd encountered this in platform 2, and we'd discovered a number of artifacts from there, so we were hoping that we would find a similar level of preservation, or at least artifacts cropping up. Unfortunately, there was not a great deal, so work was halted at this phase as we were getting more joy from platform 2, and we wanted to maximise our potential returns. However, it is worth noting that if we were to return to platform 1, I suspect we would find a similar level of preservation and hopefully structural remains in that platform. That was that one there. Now you can see the trenches we've got. So obviously this is the back of the platform here. You can see they've cut firmly into the bedrock. So for those who don't know, platforms like this are formed when people at the time are hacking into the hillside and pushing that material down slope to form a wider, flatter surface that they can then exploit. This would have been done presumably with antlermatics, stone tools, which I imagine sounds terrible. I mean, digging out with steel was hard enough, Yep, and you can also see this nice stone surface I was on about here. It does cover the majority of the platform itself, but unfortunately we didn't take it any further within this platform. Platform 2, this was our primary area of focus. Again, we started with smaller L-shaped trenches, but we expanded these over time as work progressed. It was a multi-phased occupation with periods of abandonment and reoccupation over time, multiple periods, in fact. We also recovered over two dozen artifacts and a number of environmental samples. Oop, that one. Yes. So, phasing. I'd say the phasing is probably the most interesting part of the whole site. The first event I would class as the formation of the platform, as in digging it out. This is then followed on with an initial period of occupation. In my opinion, there's phases of occupation within this initial phase of occupation, as complicated as that sounds. We uncovered 2 separate hearths, which you can see here. And what it seems is that they've either been altering the round house as they've been going, so they've been, living there, but then moving or rebuilding it whilst living there, or it's been temporarily abandoned and then they've come back to it and rebuilt the structure on top of where they were. You can also see here, so we have one hearth here, is postal, 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 postal. Then this is the second hearth with a large charcoal spread, and a ring of postals here. I would say we can firmly say that is one post ring, but then you've miscellaneous other postals that don't seem to line up with much, which I would say supports this theory. Moving back, immediately atop of this layer is a layer of slope wash, which I would say marks the first period of abandonment of the site. It is covered over by this. On top of this is a thin layer of occupation that we returned several artefacts, including a whetstone, a small lamp fragment, and some of the pottery came from this as well. Directly on top of this is that stone rubble deposit I mentioned in platform 1. From this we found several hammerstones, some other artefacts. Interestingly, with the stone rubble, when we first came across it, it was heavily disturbed by bracken rooting, which was pervasive across the entire hillside. Again, a real pain to dig through. And we were of the opinion that it was just collapse, it was tumble. But as we started pulling artifacts out of it, we've kind of changed our minds on it, and I'd probably say it looks like the remains of a very, very disturbed stone surface. The final event, obviously, on top of this, was a layer of slope wash that represents the final abandonment of the site. Boom. You can see here, up in this picture on the top left, top left, that stone layer, again, very pervasive, very wide across the entire site. After we removed it, this is what this initial phase of occupation looks like prior to full excavation. There's a large charcoal spread. The hearth is kind of roughly here. The second hearth is here. I would say this is probably the first hearth, or the earliest one, and then they've made this one second, or they've come to use this one second at a later date. And finally, I'll get it away. You can see we've removed most of the charcoal deposit, trying to find anything else. There was this large terrain, a bit of terrain in here, but we don't know what it's for. There's also an internal gully, an internal partition perhaps, kicking around on the inside. Artifacts. So we recovered 24 artifacts from, we burned, all of them were from platform 2. And they came in a wide variety, from core stone tools to ceramic pottery sherds. This assemblage is, as Stuart mentioned, what I would say is from a small domestic dwelling. We didn't see much evidence of large-scale industry. They weren't processing much grain. There was no real evidence of metalworking on site, but we'll get to that. This is probably the strangest find we got on site. It was nicknamed the Birdstone, for obvious reasons. It's quite a strange thing. So this area here is the only worked facet on site. It was a small, almost like a ring mark. There are no other worked edges on it. This shape is natural in form or origin. We don't really know what it was, but just kind of cool, to be quite frank. It's genuinely no other function beyond what we can see there. Core stone tools, we found 5 core stone tools. All were made of river-rounded sandstone cobbles. There were a variety of forms in usage. Some, such as this one here, were single-use pounders or hammerstones that were picked up, used one and done, expeditiously used, and then chucked. You have others, such as this stone here, though, which had almost kind of multi-tools. They were used as hammerstones, grinders there, maybe a temporary work surface. So there's evidence that they were still using lots of stone tools, as matches up with other sites in the area, and also that they were doing small-scale industry. There was nothing massive going on here. This slide. So first up is an example from our lithic assemblage. I'll come on to more of this later, but it is just a simple quartz piece. It's relatively undiagnostic, and its origin is not terribly certain. It may be from a result of modern work during the forestry and the planting of the trees. The whetstone was probably my favourite find from this site. This was a really, really nice object. It was, in contrast to most of the other stone artifacts, it's a very, very fine-grained siltstone. Every facet of it, all sides of it were worked. And to my mind, it was something that had been taken care of. You can see it was used quite a lot. There was striations from a blade being sharpened on it. This was not just some random stone picked up and used. This was someone's personal, implement. This was being used by someone over a period of time, and they'd taken care, in forming it, but also making sure it stayed intact. Because a lot of the other finds on site were very damaged and in fragments, as you can see with the one to the right of it. This stone here is a single sandstone cobble that has been hollowed out, either to make a mortar or a lamp. We think personally a lamp. Along this edge, there was evidence of kind of sooting or blackening, presumably from burning. Pottery. We found 8 ceramic sherds in total from across the site, 7 of which were rather undiagnostic body sherds and 1 rim sherd. Unfortunately, preservation was very poor, and so we were not able to gain more from them other than that they were later prehistoric in age, roughly Bronze Age. But unfortunately, and there was a minimum of 2 vessels, as many as 4. Unfortunately, they were too worn to really accurately gain a good idea of how many we had. Lithics, excuse me one sec. The lithic assemblage was somewhat disappointing, to be honest. We got 14 pieces of lithic, 9 of which were quartz, 4 were chert, all of which, aside from 2, were just nodules. As I mentioned earlier, many of these nodules appeared to be rather unworked, or if they did show signs of chipping or flaking, that it appears to be accidental, perhaps during the formation of the platform itself, or in later modern forestry practices. The only 2 worked pieces were a post-medieval gunflint, which is obviously not from this site, and a single worked flake. I'm afraid not much to say there on that. Ecofacts. So we took 21 bulk samples from across the site, from a variety of sources, including the hearths, occupation deposits, the stone bank itself at the rear, and pits and post holes. We recovered a total of 91 macroplant samples, the majority of which came in the form of hulled barley, and wheat. Unfortunately, this assemblage was too small to really get an accurate idea of which was the dominant plant being exploited, as they appeared in roughly equal quantities. In terms of non-cereal crops, non-farmed or wild food sources, there was 1 hazelnut shell found from in one of the pits. It seems to be, that's the only evidence we have they were exploiting natural resources within the area. And again, with the charcoal debris, it was all things like alder, birch, oak, trees that we know grew well in the area. So I think in terms of how they're exploiting the landscape, it's all very much local. They're not bringing anything in. It's all small scale stuff. We also recovered 3 chunks of animal bone. And again, unfortunately, the preservation made it quite difficult to tell anything other than that they were animal bone. To sum up the ecofactual analysis, I would say it's hard to really put your finger on it because it is so poorly preserved. But it is definitely, there's not masses of it. There's not massive cereal crop remains as you're getting with Stuart's site. It is much more small, much more limited, and I would say very much in line with a small domestic settlement. To conclude, so we can say firmly from the carbon dates, it is Middle Bronze Age. This is partially confirmed by the pottery, which if you look at sites like the Winchy Gutter and Greennow and the Bodsbury Hill excavations, which all took place in the 80s and 90s, they returned pottery of much better quality, or much better preservation rather, but of a very similar form, very similar kind of fabric, which I would say does line up quite nicely with what we've got here. It is multi-phased. Unfortunately, we couldn't complete our work due to the pandemic, but if we were to return, I'm sure we'd get more from it. So, just to finally kind of contrast the two between each other, there are 3 ways I think we can really look at these sites, because as you'll notice, there's quite a vast difference between the two. First is preservation conditions. They're kind of the inverse of each other, if I had to be honest. Weeburn exhibits poor preservation conditions for things like artefacts, for ecofactual remains, but our context, I would say, were all quite secure. Beyond the stone at the top, everything else was relatively undisturbed, relatively unbioturbated, and things like our carbon dates and all the pits were quite secure. If you look at Popple, however, it has been heavily truncated by ploughing. You've got good preservation for things like macroplant. Just to put it in context, we had 91 macroplant samples. Stuart got 776. Minor difference in size there. This obviously implies that whilst things are surviving on Stuart's site in greater detail due to the agricultural activity, his contexts are perhaps not quite secure. Things are being dragged about the place. It's harder to pin down with relative certainty where things are coming from. Also, there are two very different forms of occupation. If Weeburn is purely medieval, or not medieval, sorry, purely mid-Bronze Age. Stuart's site stretches from the very late Bronze Age into the Iron Age and then all the way into early historic and the medieval period. And finally, Weeburn's, the geographical differences are also quite stark and I think quite important. Weeburn, as an upland site, these platforms are very small. There is not, by virtue of building on a hillside, they have very limited space. Stuart's site is an open arable field. It's in the lowlands. They've got plenty of space and plenty of opportunity for the reuse of this site in multiple different eras. By the time you get to the end of the Bronze Age, there is obviously the climatic change, and living that high in a hill becomes no longer viable because it's too bloody cold. And that's all I've got for you. Thank you very much.